is your last lab of the semester. Hooray! I'm happy. I'm just as happy as you. I might be happier. Anyway, our last lab kind of pulls the whole semester together as we look at the concept of evolution. Now, this is something we've kind of been talking about the whole semester, even in the first chapter when we talk a little bit about like the best survive. In my class, I always talk about how camouflage is a really big part of survival of the fittest, if you will, and how evolution plays a role in that. So in this lab, you have a short objective list, shorter than most of those we have in the lab book, but make sure that you can do these 3 things. And then we're going to be looking at a few big vocabulary words and a lot of math, really. This lab is going to be a lot of math. How is it that I ended up with like all the math labs and O'Grady didn't? I don't know. Oh well, I will appreciate my math labs. So let's talk a little bit about evolution. So evolution is very simply just the change in a population. So remember, a population is a group of organisms that can interbreed of the same species that are in one location. So we're just looking at one location at a time. Now obviously there are different levels of evolution, which we'll look at, but all we're looking at here by definition is a change in a population. Now, we cannot discuss evolution without at least mentioning these 2 bearded individuals, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. They are considered like the grandfathers of evolution. Now, most of you have probably heard of Darwin. He tends to be the one that everyone calls upon when we talk about evolution, but Alfred Russel Wallace was actually basically doing the same thing Darwin was at about the same time, and a lot of their information was presented at the same time. So both of these individuals went on journeys around the world, basically along the coasts by boat, and collected things like birds and butterflies, and were able to note different species and really kind of establish what we now know as evolution. So to lay out what this lab is going to be, we need to talk about what's called the gene pool. Okay, so the gene pool is the alleles. Remember that word back from our meiosis lab? An allele is a type of gene. So if we have many different types of alleles within a population, that is considered the gene pool. Now, if that gene pool changes, if the percentage of these alleles change, that's what we call evolution, right? We saw a change in a population. Now, physically, we can see this often, right? You can, everything from like human eye color to the beak shape on a bird is caused by the alleles, right? All of our physical characteristics are caused by the alleles. So when the alleles have changed, then our population has changed, which means evolution has happened. So in this lab, we're going to spend some time talking about how we can show that evolution happened by using some good old mathematics. Now, what I do want to note here is that evolution is not always good for all of those in the population. I know we often kind of spin evolution as this, the fittest survive, that's so great for them, but what about the ones who aren't quite as fit? So population will benefit some of the individuals in that population, right? So evolution will benefit some of them, potentially more than others, which is why we will see a change in those alleles. So, to talk about evolution, it's not just about the fittest survive, right? There are a lot of things that can cause evolution. So we talk a little bit about these 5 mechanisms, one of which you talked about in your DNA chapter, right? When you were talking about genetics and DNA earlier in the semester, we talked about mutations. So if there's a change in the DNA that causes a permanent change that can be passed down through the generations, what we would call a heritable mutation, that can cause evolution. And another thing, which is your best, strongest survive, is natural selection. So natural selection can cause evolution, but is not the same thing, if that makes sense. So if we look at an example of both, so in this example, you can see that mutations happened, right? So we started with this one individual or group of individuals, and we had mutations. Some of them ended up with this gene variant variant. Some ended up with this gene variant, and then the original one was able to move. So with every line here, that means we've had reproduction and more of these individuals have been made. So what you see here is that there was a mutation to 3 different variants of this gene. One of them did not survive. It was not optimal for the environment. The gray one, which was the original, did survive for quite a while and then eventually mutated again. But the more favorable mutation was this one that is notated with the darker circles. And again, you can see another mutation actually happen. We had more reproduction. So what we have here, what we show here, is that mutation caused a variance within the population. Some of those mutations were better than others, right? This first mutation was not good. It was selected for. Those were unable to continue passing that gene on to the next generation. However, in this case, the darker one was able to survive quite well in this environment and actually was able to mutate to pass on even different genes within this population, and those were the ones that were able to reproduce. So mutations can cause variance within the population. Some of them could be strong enough to survive. Some might not be, right? Some mutations may end up being detrimental to that organism. But both of these things can lead to evolution. This is just an example where both of them were paired together to lead to an evolution of that population. Now, another thing that can cause evolution is what we call gene flow. This means that we have populations that are separate from each other, but there is a crossover, right? Whether we have in the picture I have here, we have 2 different types of birds, one population on one side of the mountain, one on the other, and one of the birds gets over the mountain, which means we have one of these birds that ends up in the other population and they breed, and that changes the gene and the gene pool within that population. This could, again, cause a pretty big change within this population. We end up with a bluebird on the red side. Woo! But that is gene flow. We get a change because one organism moved to another population. 4th thing, non-random mating. Okay, so random mating would basically be I put everyone's name in a hat in a population and I pull out a mating male and a mating female and tell them to go have babies. That doesn't work very well. If you followed anything about panda mating, we know that doesn't work very well. Non-random mating means you get a choice. And in the animal world especially, there are many different selections here based upon just the phenotype. Physically, what do you look like? One really great example of it is this beautiful bird. This is a peacock. This is specifically the male peacock. Now, most of you have seen the male peacock at the zoo, at least, if you haven't seen them on the TV and whatnot. I used to work with peacocks. They are very interesting organisms. But what I can tell you is they're very beautiful, but only the males. So the males end up with these giant, beautiful feathers that they can spread out. And the number one reason they spread out these feathers is to attract a mate. So they are trying to attract the female. Notice the female, not quite as impressive. Many female birds are basically brown and relatively boring. She does have a very nice neck feather going on. But the female is not selected for the big, huge feathers as where the male is. So if a male peacock does not have these big, beautiful feathers, they will be less likely to attract a mate. And because of that, we have a lot of giant feathered males. They are the ones who are more successful at passing their genes on to the next generation. The females are selected for other things, not necessarily their big, beautiful feathers. So non-random mating means we get a choice. And when you choose your mate, you're basically choosing to pass those genes onto your children so that they will then have that presented phenotype to hopefully attract a mate for the next generation. Now, the last that I have listed, I know I changed it a little bit from what's in your lab book, is looking at what's called genetic drift. So, genetic drift is what happens when you have a rather random change in alleles. So, we can have something dramatic like a tsunami wipes out a village, or you get like a forest fire that comes through and kills a bunch of trees in a population, for example. And we have different types of genetic drift. The example that I have here in this image is what we call a bottleneck, basically meaning that we start off with a rather large population and we finish with a smaller population. That small population, as you can see in this image here, has a smaller variety of what the original genetics were. So if you look at the original here anyway, there's one blue. There's a handful of reds and a handful of yellows, but there are greens and some whites that are in here as well. Those didn't make it through this bottleneck. Now, whether that is because they did what we call the founder effect and these three circles left the population, or we had some type of major traumatic event within that population, something happened where we only had 3 of these individuals left. And those are the only ones that can mate, right? So then all we end up with is a population of reds, blues, and yellows. The other population, the other genes, the other alleles in this population are now gone. That causes a change in the frequency of our alleles. That can cause evolution. Now, in your lab book, you will also see 3 big words here defined for the vocabulary to kind of round out genetics. Microevolution versus macroevolution. So microevolution is minor changes within one population. All right, so one population sees a change. And those are the main examples that I just kind of showed you, right? You have a change in the colors of something, for example. Those are small. Those can happen relatively quickly. Speciation, on the other hand, takes a really long time. This is like the long game for evolution. This is to create a whole new species. So in order to be a species, you have to be able to intermate. So if we ever get a speciation, it means that a new species has arrived and cannot mate with the previous known species. So this happens a ton with birds, right? Birds are all different species. So for example, you cannot have a robin, a good old Illinois robin, mate with a cardinal. They are different species. Even though they are birds, right? They are related, but they cannot reproduce. So that means they're a different species. And if we do get a new species to arrive out of all of this mating and changing and mutations, or any of those things we just talked about, that is what we call macroevolution, right? We've created a whole new species, which means that we have seen a bigger change in our population. That is a bigger form of evolution, and that takes a whole lot longer than microevolutions.